Welcome to another episode of the Swamp247 Podcast. I'm your host today, Zach Goodall. I'm joined by Tyler Harden, both writers over at Swamp247. And let's just get it out of the way here first. I know it's been just over a month since we last recorded. I do want to apologize for that, but I'm sure, especially once I get Tyler to talk about it a little bit, everyone will understand we've been quite busy over at Swamp247. It has been absolute madness and chaos that is the annual offseason transactional window for college football. You know, you start with a new coaching staff for John Sumrall, and that was a couple-week process because he was still coaching Tulane. That wraps up on December 20th, and you see this influx of all these coaches getting officially hired. He's filled out his staff in that time frame. While the transfer portal had not yet opened, Florida started losing players to the transfer portal. They ended up at 32 on their way out, and there's still 2 more days until it closes. Who's to say there may not be a couple more, but right now we're sitting at 32 players who have left. And in that time frame too, this is where Tyler could really speak to it. They've gained 43 players between the early signing period, which we did get to talk about last time, where they added 19, and currently Florida is at 24 transfer commitments if you include 1 preferred walk-on, 23 on scholarship, one of them from the junior college level, the other 22 coming from the Division I level, various different places, a bunch of different positions, targeted and brought on. It's just been nonstop. So Tyler, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your very, very busy schedule to stop in and talk about all the movement that's been going on. I'm sure you could use a little bit of rest when we're done with this.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like ever since November 29th was the last day, Florida played against Florida State. I feel like ever since then, life has just been one big blur, right? You go from hiring John Sumrall, then early signing day, and then, he's hiring his staff, and then you get thrown into the transfer portal, and not to mention holiday seasons right in the middle of that. Like, it's just all kind of blended together for me into like one giant, never ending something happening type of thing, right? So yeah, I mean, it's been crazy, but so many ups and downs, right? You talk about the additions, the subtractions, the retentions. It's just been, there's been so much happening, within the Florida football program. And I feel like we'll get into it a little more later on, but it's been really interesting to follow and see, you go back to John Sumrall's opening press conference and, how much he touched on there and really how much of it came to fruition, right? You talk about the transfer portal and how aggressively they've attacked that, retention, how much they prioritize like that top group of guys that really they got back, pretty much all of them into the fold. So it's been really interesting to kind of follow all this and, see how much of it aged the way that, it seems like they wanted it to.
Yeah, how silly of me to forget in that introduction of all that was going on. Maybe the most impressive thing Florida's done so far, and I know this sounds kind of counterintuitive with 32 players going out, has been their roster retention. You've got your big 5, they're calling it the Fab 5 players being held on to, and star running back Jaden Baugh, freshman edge rusher Jaden Woods, freshman star receivers Vernell Brown and Dallas Wilson, and linebacker Miles Graham. Now I would consider Miles Graham, maybe the easiest one of the group. He was never under any threat to leave. He was the first player to say he was coming back. But the other 4 were garnering some interest from teams on the outside. 3 of them never even entered the transfer portal yet. We are all very aware of the fact that Dallas Wilson, Jaden Baugh, and Vernell Brown were certainly – there was representation. There were other teams that were at least in their representation's ear, yet they managed to end up sticking around. Jaden Woods actually did enter the transfer portal and ultimately withdrew after a bit of an extended process. So I think that's a good segue. We can start with that again. I think that was really the most impressive thing they did, because when you look at the 32 players that left, I want to say 9 of them had over 100 snaps with their units last year. So not special teams, but actually playing offense or defense. Last time I checked, which was when I wrote a column late last week, I want to say 22 players were retained that took at least 100 snaps with their units. And obviously, again, starting with those top 5. So just give me your stance really on the importance of keeping those 5 players and the importance of the retention efforts that Florida put forward here in its first offseason under this staff, who they were able to hold on to, positional value of those players in the aggressive pursuit of keeping those players in Gainesville.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the importance of, retaining those five players kind of goes unsaid for Florida fans. That's kind of the core nucleus of, what you want your roster for 2026 to be, the not only the impact they can have on the field, but just the experience, right? I know Dallas Wilson has had limited snaps, but when he was on the field, I mean, he was as impactful as any player, in the country at his age, right? So, yeah, I mean, just what it took, right? I feel like, with all the Jaden Boss sweepstakes and all the uncertainty that may have loomed around that one, I feel like the most, I guess impressive retention you could say was Jaden Woods, right? Just because he was the guy that to go into the portal and, really explore other options. I mean, he was one of the more touted players in the portal once he did make his declaration. So I feel like Florida just getting him back in the fold when there were other like concrete options around the country. I know Texas was a big player there. I feel like that was, really impressive on Florida's part. We really got to see how they react to when, a player actually goes as far as to put his name into the portal. So, I feel like that was probably, the most impressive. I mean, Jaden Ball, of course, you have to retain him just for what, he means to the running back room and what he means for the overall offense. But, Jaden Woods, to me, I feel like that was kind of a little quieter of a, impact, but I feel like that was probably, the best victory they've had, in this portal window.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And you might look at Jaden Woods' box score. I know Florida fans, like when he first went into the portal, they were like, oh, 3.5 sacks. Guess that's replaceable. But it's about the projection for him to do that as a freshman in a room that was quite talented. I mean, they've got multiple draft prospects on the edge in Tyreek Sapp and George Gums, who are no longer here. So you assume while he played quite a bit as a freshman, Jaden Woods is going to step into a starting role this year. He knew that his market was effectively and accordingly, it matched that. There were teams pursuing him to be a starting edge rusher on their squad, making it all the more impressive for Florida to hold on to him. Are there any other ones that maybe stand out to you that aren't necessarily that top five, but of players who have either agreed to new deals or not even either? They have agreed to new deals. I guess some of them didn't really announce it because I'm not sure that everyone was necessarily under threat of leaving, but we did see like this big wave of, I want to say 25, 30 players announcing that they will be coming back and they've reached new deals. Was there anyone that kind of stood out to you amongst that group?
Yeah, I feel like, when it comes to, of course, Florida fans haven't really been able to see him, really in a consistently healthy way. I feel like you have to look at LJ McCray and just the ceiling he has and the upside he has, on that defensive front. I feel like, just his size and, his just ability, I guess you could say, is just really hard to ignore, and what he can, really provide to that defensive front, not only just from like a size and, like I said, ability standpoint, but a versatility standpoint as well. I mean, you could stick him on the edge, you could stick him in the interior. I mean, nowadays when I feel like, especially now when, Florida's actively looking for more numbers on the interior defensive line, I feel like, having versatility like that is kind of, underrated in a way, and kind of really kind of few and far between. So yeah, I mean, I feel like LJ McCray, if he's healthy, God willing, he can make a good impact this year for Florida. And I feel like that was a big retention that kind of, slipped through the cracks, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I agree it did. And yeah, that's got to be because of injuries. I think he was limited to 4 snaps this season because he entered the season hurt, played 4 snaps against USF, I want to say something like that, broke his foot, out for the rest of the year. But he was one of 2 5-star prospects that signed with Florida under Billy Napier. So really another perfect segue here onto the next point. The other did leave, being quarterback DJ Lagway, following his tumultuous season with Florida. The expectations were through the roof. You heard people talking about him as a potential Heisman Trophy candidate entering his sophomore year from what was a successful freshman season. Not perfect, threw 9 interceptions, and that was something he was going to need to cut down on. But 12 touchdowns. Florida went 6-1 in the games he started as a freshman. Really, the arrow was pointing up as long as everything went well. It didn't. Nothing really went well at all. He had a myriad of injuries throughout the offseason, 3 separate ones, some needing more attention than others. And ultimately, he was not able to participate in team drills or practice fully until 12 days before the season started, either in spring or fall. And I think we saw a reflection of that in his season. He led the SEC in interceptions thrown. You saw the development really wasn't there, especially the first 4 or 5 games of the season. There was just so much rust for him to shake off. Talk of the injuries even lingering into the year, and he picked up another 2 minor ones at one point. It impacted his ability to run the ball. He just wasn't the dual threat that people anticipated him being. And when you consider the lack of practice, the development just wasn't there. So it was a bit of a surprise considering he had maintained that he was happy in Gainesville. And his recruiting ranking, the potential that people still believed he had, it came as a bit of a surprise, I believe, on December 15th when he ended up announcing that he was going into the portal. There's been talk that his initial meeting with John Summerall on their staff didn't really resonate with him. It didn't sound as though it was like a bitter situation or any sort of argument, but more so that just it wasn't a match. So he is now since committed to Baylor. There's been word that he could still be kind of testing his options, but the longer we go since his, I want to say Friday-ish commitment to Baylor, he has yet to back off of it. That's obviously where his father played. So that ship has sailed in Gainesville. And Florida went out and added a quarterback through the portal that this new staff has familiarity with, and Aaron Philo from Georgia Tech. He was there for a couple of years, coming in as a redshirt sophomore, but played under Buster Faulkner, the Gators' new offensive coordinator, and played as, a bit of a stretch, I guess I could say. He's appeared in 8 games in his career, has just over 100 passing attempts. He's thrown for 938 yards with 2 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. Also has a rushing touchdown. I've seen it said a little bit that he's not much of a mobile threat, but I'll give him credit. Over his, 103 dropbacks, he's taken 1 sack. He's got positive rushing yardage, averaging nearly 6 yards per carry. And that's the kind of stat that does include sacks as a negative. It factors that in. So you see that there is some mobility there to work with. He broke a passing yards record for that Trevor Lawrence previously held in the state of Georgia. So there's certainly a lot to like about Aaron Philo, and probably nothing more than Buster Faulkner identifying him as the quarterback he wanted him to follow to Gainesville. It didn't even sound as though there were really too many tires kicked on other quarterbacks that were in the portal. He entered, I want to say, a week before Georgia Tech's bowl game, not officially, but announced he would be entering. And we kind of knew right on the spot that he was going to end up following Faulkner to Florida a couple of weeks later. They identified him as their guy, and effectively that is Florida's quarterback swap. There's the chance that Tramel Jones, the rising redshirt freshman who had appeared in 2 games for Florida this year, could compete with Philo for the position. But just you consider that familiarity. You consider that he was really the target all along. It would appear, at least as of January 14th, so plenty of practice time between now and the start of the season, he's got the leg up on being Florida's starting quarterback for the 2026 season, at least come week 1. So with all that, Tyler, what do you make of that move? How beneficial do you think that familiarity is? And I guess if you could kind of measure the trade-off in a more established quarterback, yet one who was flawed and had a rough season leaving, in order to take a quarterback who, is right now still largely potential based, even though he's got that familiarity on his side.
Yeah. First I'll start with Lagway. When you look at it from a grand standpoint, it had to happen, right? Lagway needed that fresh start, and what better, time to get a fresh start was when a new staff is coming in, right? This is kind of like, hey, this is your window of time to, go explore other options, go explore a better fit, go, explore somewhere where maybe you could thrive a little better. I just feel like, from the outside looking in, Lagway there was a lot of pressure on him at a certain point during the season, right? It just kind of kept adding up. And that's why the results never really, came together. It was just, there was too much, right? I feel like he just needed a clean slate. And like I said, what better time to get a clean slate for when, Florida's getting a clean slate itself, right? So I feel like, for both parties, this was just what had to happen. And, of course, like you said, Baylor is, as of right now, looking like the spot that DJ will end up in. So, of course, we hope for, a turnaround on his part. We all know what DJ Lagway could be. And, let's hope he can find that in Waco. But, when it comes to Aaron Philo and the familiarity he has with, Florida's current staff and Buster Faulkner, the offensive coordinator, several other Georgia Tech staffers, AJ Erdely, the assistant quarterbacks coach, also came from Georgia Tech. So, when it comes to familiarity and, wanting results right away, there's a very good chance that Philo will be the guy day one. Familiarity is just really going to, amplify itself, or I guess you could say, on, how quickly results will come to the table. You're automatically more comfortable when you have familiar faces around you. And I feel like that's where Philo will really kind of separate himself, because, he feels comfortable. He knows Buster Faulkner. I mean, I believe, and don't quote me on this, I think they go back to, Faulkner has background in, the school that Philo went to, Prince Avenue Christian in, Eastern Georgia. So there is a lot of familiarity there. And, I feel like that's where results will come to the table. They'll kind of, the roots will be there. And I feel like that's where it all kind of pay off for Florida.
And we'll circle back more to some of the transfer losses later, but I do want to get into the additions, where you, I would say, have covered this transfer cycle as well, if not better than anyone covering Florida. Certainly one of the busiest reporters in this cycle compared to the traditional team reporters. But I mean, they've added, again, 24 players. It seems as though it's a bit an even split, offense and defense. We could even split it offense to defense. But you look at the weapons they put around Philo, not just the retention of Jaden Baugh, Dallas Wilson, Vernell Brown, but to go out and right now easily their highest rated transfer is Eric Singleton Jr., the Auburn wide receiver, another player who comes from, while he was at Auburn last year, was at Georgia Tech the 2 years prior. So played for Buster Faulkner, Trent McKnight, the inside receivers coach, and he is primarily a slot. So you would think that would have a little bit of a factor in this recruitment. There's, I mean, I didn't even have them all in my notes, but I should have them now. There are 4 players coming from the Georgia Tech offense, the tight end, Luke Sharpring, offensive lineman Harrison Moore, I think kind of stands out among the group considering his starting experience. He's someone that could reasonably go in and start at either center or guard, I think, for this team. Wide receiver Bailey Stockton has some experience playing as well from Georgia Tech, but also there are players outside of that group. Interior offensive lineman TJ Shanahan is someone that follows new Gators offensive line coach, a familiar name to Florida fans as a former Florida offensive tackle with the national championship teams, Phil Troutwine. And he even brought a second Penn State offensive lineman in Egan Boyer. Another couple, there's another tight end. You'll have to help me with his name if I get it wrong. Lakota Dupree
Yep.
from
Dupree,
James Madison.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Wake Forest wide receiver Micah Mays. So if you want to just start with the offensive side of the ball, some of the guys that stand out to you that they've brought in, and for some of these bigger names, even maybe like what their role could look like, how valuable an addition they are to this 26 roster, especially.
Yeah. So for the offensive side of the ball, I'll give 3 names here. And, the first one is going to be Evan Pryor, Cincinnati running back, redshirt senior. He's going to have 1 year in Florida, if I'm not mistaken. And just kind of, I've highlighted this a lot, throughout his, portal recruitment with Florida. This is a kid, he's been plagued by injuries throughout his, collegiate career. He spent some time at Ohio. Well, he started at Ohio State, then he went to Cincinnati for 2 seasons. I feel like, and he kind of touched on this with me, he hasn't really had a season where he could, exceed his or meet his potential. Right. So I feel like Florida, just what they're getting, he's a former 4-star recruit, right? I want to say he was ranked in the top 100 in the class of 2021. So that's what you're getting out of Evan Pryor. And I feel like, under the right development with Chris Foster, the upside is certainly there. So I feel like Evan Pryor is not only one with upside, but somebody who can also, complement Jaden Baugh really well, not only just from an ability standpoint, but an experience standpoint as well. So Evan Pryor is definitely one, to watch for Florida fans. The other one to stay in the running back room is London Montgomery. Just, from a longevity standpoint, this is a kid, he has multiple years of eligibility left. He's going to have a year to learn under Evan Pryor and Jaden Baugh and just kind of, be a sponge for them and, maybe even get some reps back there as well. I expect him to get, pretty good playing time, right? This is a kid that he had 2 years at East Carolina where he was very productive in both those years. So this is a kid, a lot of people look at him as a depth piece, but he's a guy, he has experience at the Division I level. So, London Montgomery is another one who could be a quiet contributor in the backfield. And then the third one is Egan Boyer. Like you said, a lot of Florida fans are kind of scratching their head like, oh, are we going to add a left tackle, right tackle, somebody on the exterior offensive line? I had a source tell me that, Egan Boyer has, Penn State thought of him as a guy with first round upside, right? So I feel like that's what you're getting in Egan Boyer, that not a lot of people may really know a ton about him. I feel like he kind of got slipped through the cracks because of TJ Shanahan and the background he has with, of course, Phil Troutwine, but also just the state of Florida. He's from Orlando. So I feel like Egan Boyer is one to, definitely have a lot of confidence in as well, because, he has that first round upside. I can see it myself. He's, hasn't had a ton of playing time at Penn State, but I feel like, just his size and under the right development with Phil Troutwine, and, there's not a lot of coaches, at the Division I level that develop as well as Phil Troutwine. So, I feel like those three, as of right now, I'm watching the closest, but really, the offensive side of the ball for Florida's transfer classes is one to be really excited about as a whole.
Yeah, and I want to circle back to Singleton too, just to see like what your thought process on how that whole situation went down, because he's arguably maybe the most unique transfer of the group. He was someone that people thought could have first round NFL draft upside when he transferred to Auburn a year ago. I remember he was top 5 in his transfer class. He was the number 1 wide receiver. He goes to Auburn. Their offense struggled. They fired Hugh Freeze. Just a lot of things that kind of got in Singleton's way. But he entered the NFL draft unofficially this offseason too. I would assume that he did not hire an NFLPA certified agent, which is kind of what like solidifies that you were entering the draft. Once you do that, you don't go back. But he had put it out there that he was intending to enter the draft. I think it was another 2 weeks later, he ends up entering the portal. A day or so after that, maybe 2 days after that, he commits to Florida. Like, I'm not even sure if he ended up taking a visit, but again, there's that familiarity with the staff. He's got a great wide receiver room around him. That should have like you would think about maybe that could impact his production because the ball can only go to one player and they've got a few around him, but they're all kind of unique. Mentioned what Dallas Wilson can be when he's healthy. And he's obviously a very different receiver than Vernell Brown, who's more of the slot. These guys should all complement each other really well. And to me, while he goes into his true senior year, he'll only add to his production. And I would think maybe boost his NFL draft resume going into next offseason. So I'm curious just what you know about that recruitment, how it went down, and if you see it similarly where this could really, elevate him going into next year's draft compared to what may have happened if he stayed in this year's.
Yeah. So when you ask me, most impactful transfers on the offensive side of the ball, obviously Eric Singleton's number one. Mm-hmm. I feel like that was the easy answer though, but no, I
get it.
Yeah. Eric Singleton, you go back to the aspect of familiarity, right? What a way for that to pay off, in one of the top receiver transfer prospect recruitments of this cycle, right? Not only does he have the Georgia Tech familiarity, but he also has the Auburn familiarity with wide receiver coach Marcus Davis. So there was just a lot of arrows that pointed toward Florida, right when he announced he's going to withdraw his name from the draft and enter the portal. It took almost no time at all for Florida to be the one to watch. And obviously that ended up, it didn't take long for that to come true. So, but yeah, when you look at his game next to Vernell Brown and Dallas Wilson, obviously those two are very good vertical threats. Eric Singleton primarily being a slot guy, he kind of fills in that gap as well. And you can, a lot of people look at those three as kind of like the three to watch for the Florida receiver room. I feel like that's absolutely true. And Eric Singleton's game definitely complements Dallas's game and Vernell's game, really well with his slot ability.
And then if we flip it to the other side, here's another one. I need help with his pronunciation. But you look at his film and you look at what he put in his 1 year of playing college football so far at Jacksonville State, and defensive lineman Emmanuel
Badejo. I think that's how you say it. Don't quote me on that though. That's my best crack at it. So
it's better than what I would have gone with. But 36 quarterback pressures, Some other really nice stats, again, coming from 1 year of playing college football. He's someone that is a United States transplant from Manchester, England. I believe he was playing some football over there, but got his college football start last year and became a commodity in this year's transfer portal. He's someone that I think will absolutely need to keep an eye on, especially because Florida needed to beef up its defensive line. I think he's got some experience playing the edge, but at his size, and I don't even have that in front of me. It's, yes, I do, 6'7", 295. Reasonably would probably play a good bit of interior defensive line here too, if not primarily. And then they really attacked the secondary as well. They brought in a pair of safeties in DJ Coleman and Cam Dooley. Cam Dooley's another one where you look at familiarity as an important thing, right? Playing at Kentucky, had a productive year this year under now Gators and former Wildcats defensive coordinator Brad White, and there's some other staff familiarity there with Chris Collins, the safeties coach. And I think the most recent one was Kanye Clark too, right? The defensive back from UCLA. So another, on this side of the ball, they were aggressive in attacking needs. I think, I don't have it in front of me, but Florida lost quite a few of their experienced players that went to the portal. A lot of them came from the secondary. Granted, arguments can be made one way or another as to how impactful they were, because I do think Florida's secondary, especially the back end, the safeties and the star nickel corner, needed some improvements, and Florida was quick to go out and try and address those. In fact, I think DJ Coleman was the first commitment they got in the portal, if I'm not mistaken. So kind of same deal. They're players you want to highlight, the approach to what they did on defense, just what stood out to you when you flip it to the other side of the ball.
Yeah, so first, obviously, you have to point at Emmanuel Oyabadejo out of Jacksonville State. I mean, just his story alone. I mean, I highlighted it, around the time he committed. I think the day he actually committed, I spoke to him, and this is a kid. He was a medical student at 18 years old. He's 21 right now. So this is a guy that he's done a lot in a short period of time, and that's what Florida's getting, a guy with tremendous upside, tremendous ceiling. But you also, I would give him a comp to LJ McCray. Kind of, that similar hybrid build, could throw him in the interior, could throw him on the edge. I think Florida's primarily looking at him to, go off the edge, and, at his size, that's a scary thing, right? I believe they clocked him in at 6'7", 295. So yeah, I mean, that's a scary thing, to come off the edge at that size and, that, athletic ability. But, let's not get it mistaken. This is a kid that he's going to need a lot of development this offseason. And that's something, Gerald Chapman, defensive line coach, definitely prefaced with him throughout this process. They often talked about like, hey, you get down here, this winter, and you really put a lot of time in and put a lot of time into the lab and really get to work, you could be, a first round draft pick. And that's the way Florida kind of expects him to be, a plug and play guy come the fall. And, after a productive off season, they hope those kind of expectations come true. And then, to go back to the secondary, like you just did, DJ Coleman, right? That's safety nickel room was getting kind of young. It was getting kind of thin. You add DJ Coleman not only as a guy that could come in and play right away, but, he has that collegiate experience, right? 3 years at Baylor. He was productive and just about all of them. So this is a guy that he can come right in and play right away. Cam Dooley, of course, going back to that aspect of familiarity that we've been talking about a lot in this episode. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be excited about, not only just on, like I said, the offensive side of the ball and the defensive side of the ball, just all around, right? This has been a really, I think you could say quietly good, portal window for Florida. I mean, there were a lot of emotions up and down, throughout this window, but I feel like they filled in the holes they needed to fill. And at this point, the more the merrier, right? Florida's not done yet. So I feel like, when you look at the defensive side of the ball, like you said, there's a lot to be excited about, from top to bottom.
Yeah. And to keep it on filling needs, maybe an underrated aspect of this portal window too, is all three of Florida's starting specialists this past year are gone out of eligibility and trying to hit the NFL draft. But then also they had anticipated replacements at every position. They were true freshmen this past season and would have been redshirt freshmen this year. So in theory, would have been long-term replacement starters, Evan Knoll, Hayden Craig, and Mac Mulhern, respectively, at kicker, punter, and long snapper. Well, all three of them ended up hitting the portal. So Florida had like nothing except for maybe some walk-ons at those positions. And don't quote me on that. They may not have even had other walk-ons there. So they had to go and fill those as well. And they did do that pretty quickly. There were two people love to talk about the whole John Summerall not hiring my friends thing. And I think that could have translated to people predicting, well, okay, but like, is he still going to bring people from Tulane? And is he going to bring players from Tulane? And they only brought in 2 transfers from Tulane. They have not, and I think there were some visits with some others, but ultimately there are only 2. And quite frankly, I think they make complete and total sense at kicker and at punter, with Patrick Durkin coming in to be the kicker and Alec Clark coming in to be the punter. They also brought in a Louisiana long snapper transfer, Carter Milleron, I think, or Milleron. And then they brought in a second punter as well, who had originally committed to UT Martin, but has since flipped in Miller Feely. So, maybe they could use some walk-ons at the to back up Durkin at kicker, Milleron at long snapper. They have a backup punter, but same type of deal. They recognized their needs and very quickly went and filled them. Now it could be someone you've already mentioned even, but when you look at this class again, now at 24 players and counting, like you mentioned, they've got 2 or 3 more visits lined up for this week. So in theory, we could be pushing 30 by the time the week's over. But is there anyone that stands out to you as maybe the most underrated signing, or if there are a couple ones that maybe aren't garnering the attention right now as, say, an Eric Singleton, an Emmanuel? I'm just not going to try it. As an Aaron Philo, are there any ones that maybe, even if it's not for 2026, but more longer-term projects, guys who might have a little more eligibility left, that you think could end up turning into impact players for Florida?
Yeah, really, honestly, guys I've mentioned, right? You go to DJ Coleman, just the immediate impact I feel like he can have. Also with Cam Dooley, kind of same thing. But really, I'm excited to see how London Montgomery really kind of ages in that backfield, being that, expectedly Jaden Baugh, will go to the NFL draft after the 2026 season, and Evan Pryor, either he goes to the NFL draft or at the very least he's run out of eligibility. Being as of right now, without really anticipating other additions, which there will be, London Montgomery, he's going to be kind of the guy, right? He's going to be the familiar name in that backfield, regardless of who they add. He's going to be the familiar name, assuming that he stays for the 2027 season. So, I feel like from an offensive standpoint, you have to look at him as somebody, you got to wonder how he's going to age, and the 2026 season is going to be a really kind of determining factor on what to expect going forward.
Yeah, I really like that pickup, and you had mentioned him earlier too, but Pryor as well. You look at what Jaden Baugh does well, and quite frankly, I think he does most of the things a running back should do pretty well. It was funny when Billy Napier would comment on him needing to improve in pass protection. I actually think he was a pretty solid pass protector, and I think his grades would back that up too. But this isn't a Billy Napier podcast anymore. But you look at what Jaden Baugh does is more of the bigger power back. Evan Pryor is the guy that can kind of get from 0 to 100 pretty quickly. Shiftier, kind of change of pace guy. I really like that pickup as well. I like what they did with their running back room. We can circle back to the losses. We don't really need to keep it here too much. And I think we've already kind of answered one of the questions about it. Again, I think only 9 players of this group that's gone had over 100 snaps with their unit last year. Comparatively, I think there were 13 players who appeared in 5 or fewer games with Florida in their Florida careers, not even just last year, but in general. So when you balance it like that, like obviously 32 gone to 24 new players seems like a bit of a discrepancy. You'd wonder if Florida kind of lost out, but arguably, like I think you look at the retention paired with the transfers, and I think it easily outweighs the talent that they lost. But that's not to say that they didn't lose some talented players as well. Again, there's DJ Lagway, Eugene Wilson, someone who was a freshman All-SEC, maybe even freshman All-American, if I'm blanking. But last 2 years were not the same, dealing with a lot of injuries. Start of this past season was really a struggle for him up until the Georgia game. He was largely unproductive up there until week 9 or 10. Jordan Castell is someone who's got a ton of experience. I want to say he played and started 34 of his 35 games over 3 seasons and certainly put up some production, but there were some struggles there as well with missed tackles and coverage. And I could hedge it both ways for a lot of these guys, but when you look at their losses, which ones do you think stung the most? And the part that we kind of have already answered is, do you feel as though Florida did a good job in its portal pursuits of shoring up those positions that became a need when they lost those players?
Well, to answer the question that you just answered right there, I feel like yes, they did kind of, cancel out those losses with, at least, comparable players, if not exceeded those expectations, at least for right now. The one is kind of still a question mark, but the first one I'll allude to is, Eugene Wilson, right? That I feel like Florida fans never really got to see him fully healthy, right? At least for a long period of time. So I feel like just what he could have been with alongside Dallas Wilson and Burnell Brown, there's always going to be a what if. But I feel like now that they've brought in Eric Singleton, you'll be able to see that, if not a better version of that. But then you look at the interior defensive line, like I said earlier, just being that's a area that's Florida's still attacking right now. I'll look at somebody like Mekhi Barrow, somebody that, still had multiple years left at Florida, and just kind of what he could have been with some experience. But, they're actively looking for somebody to fill in that, big body nose tackle role, and they'll have somebody on campus this weekend, and it's Samu Taumanu Pepe from Baylor. Started his career at Texas A&M. He'll be there this weekend, and like I said, that's another big body nose tackle. I've had a source tell me they look to fill his exact role as Mekhi Barrow had. So I look at those two as impactful losses, maybe one a little louder than the other, but yeah, those are the two I'd say were kind of, quietly or loudly impactful.
And I'm sure as we get further into this offseason, we'll get into deeper breakdowns, whether it's position by position, certain specific players that they've added, even going back to the high school class. I feel like we've got a lot that we can touch on there. Again, we'll introduce the coaching staff as we get a little more into the offseason, especially when we get to talk to them in March. But to wrap things up today, I want to get your feel for your impression of the approach they took to the portal. They obviously were very quick to set up visits, and I mean, they got most of these transfers within a week of kicking off those visits, it feels like, and they've been kind of trickling in after. Florida fans would, certainly argue that the last staff was the complete opposite. They loved to talk about it. They were open, that they were very calculated, meticulous when it came to getting to know the transfer, bringing them in for a visit. Florida was pretty late sometimes in setting up visits, and then they ultimately wouldn't get them sometimes. Not just not get the player, but like the visits would not end up occurring because player X went and visited school Y and committed on the spot. This seemed a lot more aggressive and intentional in their approach to the transfer recruiting. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like, when it comes to the portal, you have to be aggressive, right? Guys that enter the portal want to get in and they want to get out as quickly as they can, right? That's why, like, the day the portal opens, guys are taking visits, right? And yeah, I mean, when it comes to Summerall staff, you have to go to the phrase, if not now, when, right? This is the time where you kind of establish that reputation on how you're going to attack the portal. And I feel like they did exactly what they were supposed to do: be aggressive right out the gate, get guys on campus. And I feel like kind of the gemstone of all this was their retention. The overwhelming majority of guys that were on campus either left committed or committed shortly after they were on campus. So, this was a staff, they did exactly what they needed to do. Were they getting 5-star transfers left and right? No. But did they need to? Also no. So I feel like this staff, was aggressive, and they had to be. And yeah, it kind of all flowed together.
100%. I think that'll do it. I mean, a lot to unpack, still a lot more for us to unpack in the coming weeks. Again, like next time we talk to you, they could be at 30 transfer commitments for all we know. But thank you for taking time, Tyler, out of what's been an incredibly busy schedule for you to do this. We're looking forward to breaking it down a little bit more. Is there anything that's kind of like on your docket here that you're hopeful to get done project-wise in the next coming days, or are you just ready to kick your feet up for a second when you're able to?
Yeah, putting a bow on this transfer class would be certainly nice, right? like you said, expect the unexpected with the transfer portal. They could very well be at 30 commitments. They could be at 25. You just don't know with the portal, right? It comes with, and so much of it being trial and error right now. I mean, everything in college football right now is trial and error. So yeah, expect the unexpected, but I'm looking forward to when they put a bow on this class. And yeah, I mean, kicking my feet up will be nice, but it never works out that way. So, we'll see what's up next after this.
No doubt. And as things do slow down, I mean, the freshmen are enrolled now. So you would think that the transfer acquisitions are going to come to a stop here pretty soon. And once that happens, it's been a little bit because Florida fired its coach midseason. So I kind of kicked the all 22 reviews that our listeners are well aware of. I'm going to bring that back. I'm going to be scouting all of the transfers that they've brought in, or at least the ones who have film available. And we'll be bringing those all over to Swamp 247 here in the coming weeks as we try to kick our feet up, or at least maybe aren't up at 6 a.m. and on our computers till 10 p.m. But that'll do it. Tyler, again, thank you so much for joining me here on the Swamp 247 podcast. I'm Zach Goodall, and until next time.